In this mini lecture, I want to discuss section 16.3, which looks specifically at the modes of disease transmission. There's a lot of information packed into this section. So we're going to start off with some definitions, then we're actually going to get into our modes of transmission. So we have the reservoir. The reservoir is the place or the location where the pathogen is normally found. So this can be in the soil, it can be in water, it can be in food, it can be in humans, in insects, and other animals. So the reservoir is where in nature the pathogen can be found. Now, when we talk about human carriers, we have passive carriers who are contaminated with the pathogen and then manually transmit it to someone else. So they're not infected with it. They're carrying it on their person. So an example of this would be, a healthcare provider going and treating one patient and then treating another patient without washing their hands in between. So they've, maybe picked up something on their hands and now they're transmitting it to someone else. They themselves are not infected with it. They're just carrying it on their body, okay? An active carrier is someone who is infected. They actually are infected with the pathogen and they transmit it to someone else. And then an asymptomatic carrier is someone who's infected, but they don't have any signs and symptoms. They can still transmit the disease to others. Now, when we look at our types of transmission, we have three overarching types of transmission. Our first is contact. And I've made a little concept map here to go through the different types of transmission. So we have contact here in the middle. And we have two groups or two types of contact transmission. We have direct and indirect. When we look at direct transmission, this is when we have people that are close together, okay? So we have horizontal transmission, which is person to person. So by touching, by kissing, through sex, it is mucous membrane to mucous membrane, essentially. We can have vertical transmission. Vertical meaning, kind of straight down. So this is mother to child. And this can occur through pregnancy, like those diseases, the TORCH acronym that I discussed in the chapter 15 mini lecture. It can occur through birth as the baby is moving through the birth canal, through the vagina. They can contract a pathogen there, or through breastfeeding. So those are all examples of vertical transmission. And then droplet. A lot of people misunderstand that droplet is direct contact transmission because droplets travel 1 meter or less. And this has been a focus of the whole COVID pandemic, is that it's transmitted by droplets. So we're typically in close contact, and that's where that 6 feet rule came. So droplets travel 1 meter or less. So when we sneeze or we cough or we talk or laugh, we emit droplets. Those travel typically less than 1 meter. And then they land on something. They land on a fomite. And that's where our indirect transmission comes in. So indirect, it's still contact because you're going to make contact with something. It's just not going to be a person or a direct droplet. You're going to make contact with something else. So we have those fomites, those inanimate objects that can transmit disease. We can have our everyday objects, and this is predominantly the way that we are infected through fomites. So things like phones, desks, doorknobs, handrails, elevator buttons, toilet handles, okay? But we also have fomites in the clinical setting. So if we have, syringes or needles that are being used more than once, catheters that aren't properly sterilized, these can serve as fomites as well. So all of this is considered contact transmission because you're making contact with either an infected individual or a fomite that has been contaminated. Our second type of transmission is vehicle transmission. And vehicle is kind of like, you kind of think of it almost like the reservoir. It's kind of where it resides. So we have waterborne, typically through poor sanitation, that the toilet and the drinking water are in the same body of water, okay? And then food-borne, we can have lack of hand washing. We can have somebody who is sick, who is shedding pathogens, and they're preparing food and they're not washing their hands. Or we could have, using feces as fertilizer. In some areas, human feces are used as fertilizer for food. And if that's not, properly washed, then it can be contaminated. Another type of foodborne illness, and typically leads to food intoxication, or what we typically refer as food poisoning, is when food sits out too long. Something that's cold sits out, it gets room temperature. So food can be a vehicle for infection. And then we have air, and we talk about airborne transmission. And I want you to keep in mind here that droplets are not airborne. Airborne transmission occurs through what we call aerosols. These are finer particles. They're much smaller particles of infection, pathogens or viruses, okay, bacteria or viruses, that basically can remain in the air. They can hang in the air with water droplets or with dust. And they're going to travel a distance of greater than 1 meter. So that's airborne. Most of the things that we think about that are transmitted through, coughing and sneezing, those are droplets. We have to be in close proximity to one another. And that's why it's considered contact transmission. But with aerosols, which are, they hang in the air, this is not contact transmission because you're going to be a lot further away from an individual. And then the last type of transmission we have is through vectors. And vectors are going to be living organisms. They're kind of like fomites, except they're alive. And we have two types of vector transmission. We have mechanical and biological. Mechanical is passive, okay? The pathogen is not a part of the vector. They're just carrying it on them. These are things like flies. Flies fly around, they land on some feces, then they land on your sandwich, okay? The fecal matter gets on their feet, gets on their wings, gets on their body, and then that transmits to your sandwich. The fly itself is not actually infected. It's just carrying it on its person, okay, or on its body. In biological vector transmission, the pathogen has to have the vector. This is kind of an active form of transmission because the pathogen and the vector are intertwined, so to speak. And the pathogen is within the vector. So this occurs in things like mosquitoes and ticks. That, a mosquito bites an infected horse, picks up some equine encephalitis pathogens, and then that pathogen will continue to grow inside the mosquito, and then when it bites you, it injects that virus into you. Same thing with ticks. So biological vector transmission, we know a lot more about these types of transmission. With mechanical, it's just a happenstance. Did the feces that the fly landed in have any pathogens that it picked up and deposited on your sandwich when it landed on it. So mechanical vector transmission is a little bit harder to track than our biological transmission. Figure 16.3, or 16.13, sorry, gives you some pictures and kind of a little introduction to some of the biological vectors, and we'll talk about most of those in great detail as we get on to our pathogens that's coming up. So that's 16.3. Make sure that you understand those different types of transmission, because that's going to become important as we are getting into our pathogens.